Hi everyone, and welcome to the LexisNexis Singapore live chat series. And we are continuing with a COVID-19 special where we hope to bring you information on the current situation that we're in to help both lawyers and laypersons navigate their way through these difficult times. So today we're going to talk about mediation and its increased importance in the dispute resolution space. We'll be speaking with Nadja Alexander today to understand how mediation can be used as a time and cost-effective solution to dispute resolution, especially in the context of uncertainty and disruption brought about by COVID-19. So my name is Hannah. I'm your host for today, and this is the live chat session. So for those of you who are tuning in, we will have a Q&A session at the end at around 3:25. So please pop in your questions into the Q&A box below, and we will pick that up. So maybe we can just get started. Nadja, would you like to give us a brief introduction to yourself, your history, who you are, and perhaps your work? Okay, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Just think about that, and I'm going to even mention technology today. Thank you, Hannah. And I'm very, very pleased to be here this afternoon. So my name's Nadja Alexander, and I'm one of those creatures that are called pracademics, and that means a practical academic or an academic practitioner, depending on the perspective that you're looking at things from. I began my career in mediation probably in the early to mid 1990s in Australia, where court mediation was really starting to take off. And I've had a fairly non-linear career path that's really taken me to a lot of different places around the world and brought me here to Singapore. I'm in my 4th year here in Singapore at the Singapore Management University, and I work with the Singapore International Dispute Resolution Academy. We call it SIDRA for short. That's based at the School of Law. That's me. Yeah.
All right, thank you for that. So let's just dive right in. I think most of our viewers today know what mediation is and they have a rough idea, but let's be a bit more specific about when we talk about mediation as applied today. Can you just tell us what is out there in the world of mediation?
So you're right. I mean, I think everybody listening knows what mediation is, and at the same time, probably everybody listening has a different idea in their head about what mediation is. And all of those ideas are right, because it's a very diverse field, right? At the same time, it's becoming a more and more structured and also institutionalized field, not just in Singapore, but internationally. And I think that's a good thing, as long as those structures, whether it be regulation or institutions, as long as they can hold that flexibility, they can capture and allow for that flexibility. And if I were to sort of take all of that, what I've just said, and look out into the market, I think, apart from looking at different practice areas, and I think everyone's familiar with that, whether it be civil matters, commercial, community, family, environmental, you name it. I think nowadays we think about things like mediation also in hybrid processes. So mediation is a standalone, but also, for example, in a multi-tiered mixed mode process with arbitration, expert appraisal involved as well. We think about online mediation also. And we also think increasingly, although I haven't seen it used so much yet in Singapore, about deal mediation. So the use of mediation in transactions, also called transactional mediation. So for example, think about a multi-party joint venture, right? Cross-border, cross-cultural, where you don't have a conflict or a dispute, but there's going to be a difficult, challenging conversation to try and put this thing together, right? And using a mediator for that. So I think when I think about the landscape now, because it's a fairly sophisticated one, there's some of the hot points for me. Use of hybrids as well as standalone, increasing cross-border, online, and also deal mediation, slowly but surely.
Okay, well, that's really cool, because it sounds like it's not confined to any particular practice area or any particular topic or subject matter. It's really sort of a cross-cutting tool almost that you can almost creatively latch on to any transaction or matter that you're dealing with and take that forward. Sorry, please continue.
I was just going to say, I like to use 2 words when I think about mediation, and they are adaptable and agile. I think it's a very adaptable process procedurally, and I think it's also agile in the sense of it can move across borders or across cultures in a way that other dispute resolution procedures that we have can't. That doesn't mean it's necessarily always the better process, but it does have those 2 features, this agility. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, and I think that's really relevant in, these current times where we're talking about the disruption that COVID has brought about. When you talk about agility and adaptability, it sounds like when our existing systems are stressed because of disruption, mediation can really come in to sort of fill those gaps. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how COVID-19 has impacted the mediation scene here in Singapore.
So I think now with COVID, we are being asked to reimagine a lot of things. We're being asked to reimagine how we work, how we live, how and to what extent we travel, how we socialize. I've got a daughter at school and now the mask is part of her new uniform, right? And they practice walking with their arms out for social distancing, and they've reinvented games that they play. They play tag with noodles rather than touching people, all sorts of things. So we're also being asked to reimagine how we resolve disputes, right? And I think mediation is already playing a big part of that. We're being asked to reimagine dispute resolution, and we're also being asked to reimagine how we mediate as well, right? So there's like the story within the story, if you like. If I take that a little bit further, if you think about the fact that already, in Singapore and around the world, right, traditional court systems are being challenged, right? Courts have either been closed or been running virtually. There is going to be a tsunami of law cases, of disputes coming before the courts that will last for months, for years, for decades, right? If you're talking about access to justice, what does that mean if you can't get to court, right, for years, right? This is one very simple way that mediation can help, right? Cost effective, efficient, and if increasingly technology is used for some people, that means better accessibility as well. But apart from that, many of the disputes that will be arising out of COVID are disputes where it's really no one's fault. Contracts can't be performed because of the situation. It's no single party's fault. And I think that resonates a lot with the idea of what mediation is, right? Trying to collaborate to reach a mutually acceptable solution so that both parties or multiple parties can move forward and get on with things, right? And CIDRA recently ran a survey. We focused on cross-border dispute resolution, mediation, arbitration, litigation. Most of our respondents were from Asia, and most of those were from Singapore. And what we found was that we spoke to users, to client users, and also to external lawyers as professional users of dispute resolution, was that particularly for clients, no surprise, but also for lawyers, preservation of business relationships was particularly important. And when people chose to use mediation or to use a hybrid rather than arbitration, and we said, well, why don't you use arbitration, right? Apart from cost, right, a big factor that came out was preservation of business relationship. Right? And I think you're going to see that increasingly now.
Okay, so it does look like there is changes that are happening to the dispute resolution scene, almost towards the angle of we've got different goals now. In the past, it was really about, I don't know, maybe winning the case and sort of like, getting justice done, getting the cash that, you are rightly owed. Towards more like preserving a long-term business relationship, because especially in the context of things being broken, our ecosystem is no longer what it used to be. We need to rebuild, and we can only really do that together. And taking an acrimonious approach can be quite counterproductive to that whole rebuilding process. So I'm just curious then, with this shift, how is this going to change the role of lawyers today?
So I think nothing happens overnight, right? And I think this has been a long time coming. So it's not just like all of a sudden, mediation is going to thrive amidst this health pandemic. I think that it's a whole bundle of factors, right? Rise of technology, there's a health pandemic, and there's been gradually over the years, and Singapore's been a world leader in this, increasing use of ADR, what the Chief Justice calls appropriate dispute resolution rather than just alternative dispute resolution, and increasing case management, right? Not to keep people away from the courts, but actually ultimately to give people better access to justice and to find appropriate ways of resolving disputes, for clients, right? Not just relying on, hitting everything with a hammer. So I think COVID is really a catalyst that's like fast forwarding mediation into its place in dispute resolution. COVID itself isn't changing the landscape, right? But it's the key to unlock what some people, what mediation supporters might call mediation's golden age. But the structures are in place, right? We also saw through the survey that we conducted that where people used mediation, and again, this was focusing, again, a lot of Singaporean respondents, but focusing on cross-border disputes, where people used mediation, they were highly satisfied with it. So we know it works. We know that where people do use it, they are by and large very satisfied with it, right? And as I mentioned previously, we've got these structures in place. So how will it change the role of lawyers? To the extent that lawyers move, more lawyers embrace mediation, whether it's as a standalone process or in hybrid disputes, I think it's also about a shift in mindset, all right? There is an old joke that says ADR doesn't stand for alternative or appropriate dispute resolution. It stands for alarming drop in revenue. You can imagine that's a lawyer's joke, right? Now, I'm here to guarantee you there is absolutely no evidence, empirical evidence anywhere that suggests that's the case. But if you do embrace, as a lawyer, consensual dispute resolution for your client as appropriate, it changes the nature of how you think about your business. It changes the nature of your business. And yes, you may help your clients resolve or manage their disputes more quickly and efficiently. And typically, anecdotally, we hear clients come to you for more often for different things as well. You may also find yourself with a slightly different clientele as well, people who didn't have access to dispute resolution before. Think of your small businesses, your sole traders, right, who, when they're involved in a dispute, particularly if it's cross-border, and cross-border might just be here to Indonesia or here to Malaysia, right? If they can't negotiate a deal, they'll typically just cut their losses, right? If, you know, because they can't afford arbitration, they can't afford mediation, they can't afford it financially, they can't afford the time away from their business, right? But if you have something like mediation that is cost effective, something that even when you combine it with technology that you can do from your home, that's a whole other clientele that potentially becomes available to lawyers. So I think it's not about giving something up to do something else. I think it's about expanding the skill set that lawyers have. And I think it's about knowing that being a mediation advocate or being a lawyer representing or advising your client in mediation is a fundamentally different skill set to that of trial advocacy, for example. And to that end, at SMU, we're in the process of developing a course that we're calling Dispute Resolution Advocacy, where we focus on mediation advocacy, arbitration advocacy, and trial advocacy. 50% of that course is focused on negotiation and mediation advocacy, right? Because what do lawyers do most of the time? Most of the time, they're not in court. Most of the time, you know, you're not, you know, before an arbitration panel. Most of the time, you're negotiating, which is what mediation is, right? But with the help of a third party. Yeah, so it's, to sum up, I think it's not a radical shift. It's been something that's coming. But when we look back, we'll probably remember COVID, right, as the pivot point, right, that began to shift dispute resolution culture.
Okay, I just have another follow-up question to that. So, I mean, obviously, when it comes to mediation, you've got your parties and you've got the mediator. Where does the lawyer sit in this sort of like structure?
So so like with many procedures, you can clients can come with their lawyers, or they can represent themselves, and it's the same with mediation. Lawyers have a big role before, during, and also after the mediation process in terms of preparation, preparing their clients for how they are going to interact in the mediation space. If I'm mediating, for example, I have a set of written forms, for want of a better phrase, like I have a mediation memoranda that I will give to the client to fill out with the help of his or her lawyer. I'm also talking to your client about mediation, how, you know, what your negotiation strategy is going to be, how you're going to work as a team, right, between lawyer and client. And that's going to depend on the nature of the dispute, how articulate the client is, how sophisticated the client is, the relationship between the client and the opposing party, who the lawyers are, right? So it's a lot about conflict and people dynamics. And then throughout the entire mediation, again, it depends. When I'm training people, I talk about 5 different models of mediation advocacy, right? So it's, again, a sophisticated type of field, right? A lawyer might be just advising the client on legal aspects, or a lawyer might be right in there with the client, right? Negotiating with them as part of a negotiating team, or in situations where a client doesn't feel able to really negotiate on their own behalf, or to articulate what their interests are. A lawyer might be more of a spokesperson for a client. And then, of course, we often think about drafting mediated settlement agreements. That's something that will typically fall to lawyers, and following up with that. But even within the mediation process itself, right? Yes, it may not be all talking. That's the lawyer's role, right? But there's a whole lot of strategy and negotiation support. The mediations consist of multiple constellations of meetings, joint session, private sessions, sometimes the lawyers together, sometimes the parties together, sometimes the lawyer and the party and the mediator, right? So it's a very exciting role. And then, of course, if you're in a mediation that's part of a mixed mode process, you can tell I'm on a roll now, sorry. Then you've got to think about, well, how does this mediation fit in to the bigger dispute resolution procedure that I'm involved in here? And I think, apart from mediation, there is a whole new field for lawyers that is, I think, fascinating, which is being a dispute management or dispute resolution expert, architect, procedural advisor, right? Helping clients to really design either pre-dispute or post-dispute, once a dispute emerges, a dispute resolution procedure tailored to suit their circumstances.
Well, that's really cool. And yes, I could tell you were on a roll there. It was it's great. It was really informative. And I think what really struck me was how varied the roles are, but they all go back to sort of the root idea, which is that we're here to work on relationships. We're here to build relationship. And I've always thought personally that what makes a lawyer, the real core work that a lawyer does is in sort of the architect of relationships in society, be it a contractual relationship or a relationship with my property, someone else's property. We're always looking at relationships, and mediation skill is something that you can really bring to that table when it comes to the work that lawyers do. And of course, this also ties in with this bigger trend of how the legal profession is evolving and shifting into one that it's not just pure legal work anymore, but it's also about being partners to your clients towards a bigger goal of fulfilling what they set out to do. And another driver of this evolution in the lawyer's role is technology. And I wanted to sort of like tie that into this current discussion on how technology is impacting, the role of the lawyer, and so is mediation. Now, how do you see these two trends converging, technology and mediation?
Well, I'll give you an example. The Singapore International Mediation Centre has introduced a COVID-19 mediation protocol. I might have the name slightly wrong. And basically what they have done, which I think is a really great example of an institution, reaching out in these circumstances to try and support people who find themselves in disputes, is they've said, look, we can offer you reduced fees, we can make sure you get to a mediation table within 10 days, and if you want, we can make part or all of that mediation online. Right, so knowing that there might be preliminary meetings as well as the mediation proper, and there might be one or more sessions of the mediation itself. Parties, particularly for cross-border disputes, might typically have met in one location or met in different locations before. I think that they are using a number of different technologies, including Zoom, something as simple as Zoom, something that somebody was saying to me yesterday. There are a lot of different technologies, whether it's for mediation or having meetings, but I think people are getting over it and just give them something they know, right? Like whether it be Zoom or something else, right? So, so Zoom itself is also suitable for mediation. But when you think about online mediation, you can have fully online, sophisticated online mediation or online dispute resolution platforms, right? With different types of dispute resolution mechanisms or mixed modes on offer. But it's also about integrating technology into the use of mediation in different ways, whether that be case management, whether that just be with the preliminary meetings. You can have text-based mediation, you can have voice, you can have video, you can have synchronous, everything live at the same time, or you can have asynchronous, so people sort of actually don't really need to stop what they're doing or stop their job. They just sort of, send a message whenever they can. So, there's a myriad of different ways. And you talked about architecture, which I think is a really nice word. So thinking about designing these procedures, when you start to mix technology with mediation, that's a whole other league again. And I have to say, years ago, I would have said, I think you also made another really good point, Hannah, about relationships. And I always say conflict happens between people, right? And the law is something we hang on to for very good reasons, right? To help us sort it out. But it actually happens between people. Transactions happen between people. What is a corporation? A bunch of people, right? With an invisible structure around it. So, mediation has the ability to reach out to those people. And I would have thought, decades ago, I was the person who said, you can't do that online, right? Forget it. But I think that's wrong. We know that there are generations of people now who fall in love online, right? Who do all sorts of things online. And certainly, it's a slightly different skill set. I think it's harder, as a mediator, it's harder to get in there sometimes and intervene online. Someone was saying the other day, it's easier for parties to say no online than if you've got them in the room. So we're navigating this new uncharted or less charted territory, let's say. But it's not just one thing, online mediation, right? It's really a whole, how can we use this technology, I would say, to give people better access to a dispute resolution forum, or better access to justice, if you want to use that phrase.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I really take your point. People do all sorts of things online. So why not resolve your disputes online as well? So, I guess the question that all of this leads to is, how can lawyers best prepare themselves for the rise of mediation as a new form of dispute resolution?
I think for those who aren't already doing so, take it seriously. It's not a soft option. It's hard. It's hard work. It puts more accountability on you as the lawyer. It puts more accountability on your client, because you can't blame a third party. You can't blame a judge. You can't blame an arbitral tribunal for getting it wrong. So, embrace it as a mindset, as something additional to what you already offer. I also think if you get the chance, do a mediation advocacy course. It's a fundamentally different skill set, as I've mentioned before. And I think it's easy to think, oh, I negotiate, I can do that. Or many lawyers think, well, I'm redundant if it goes to mediation, I've got nothing to do. Well, I hope I've made the point that there is tons for lawyers to do. And when I'm mediating, I love to work with lawyers who understand mediation, because they make my job a lot easier. And they help their clients enormously. So I would say, embrace it, take it seriously, and learn more about it, because it's not going to go away.
I completely agree with you there. Just from a personal perspective, I am an accredited mediator myself, and I took the courses. And even though I don't actually practice mediation as a job, I do something completely different. I have found that the skills that I've picked up are incredibly useful in just my day-to-day work. If you think about it, everything that we do in life at some level is negotiation, right? Like getting people to come to an agreement to move a project forward. That takes the same sorts of skills that you would in mediation. So, for those listening, I've personally found it extremely helpful. Even if you don't plan to be a mediator, I don't think you'll regret it. So with that, we're open for questions. If people want to just pop in your questions, we can get started. I think we've got one question that has come in. Are there some areas that you do not recommend to be mediated? Perhaps, if maybe there's a major power difference between parties, like any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so certainly I think it's not right to say that there's a particular practice area that's not suited to mediation, because, and of course I know that's not what the question's suggesting. I think it always depends on the, on the bundle of factors that that present in the particular case, right? The conflict dynamics, who the parties are. And here the suggestion is, what if there's a big power imbalance? Well, I think mediation works best, and it works on the assumption that the parties have the capacity to negotiate, but either they haven't done it for some reason, or they've started and they've got stuck. And as a mediator, your job is to help them get unstuck. Now, if they don't have the capacity to negotiate, for example, because one party feels intimidated, or for another reason are not able to articulate their interests in a negotiation setting, then it mightn't be suitable. Having said that, I mean, that's why you have advisory processes like neutral evaluation or case appraisal, but you also have advisory forms of mediation as well, right? Evaluative or expert advisory mediation. Now, people have different views about how, there are debates about whether that's mediation or not, and I don't want to enter that debate. But if you were concerned about that and you wanted to mediate, I would certainly be looking for a process that had a little bit more protection for, let's just say, the more potentially disadvantaged or potentially weaker party, and having a more interventionist mediator or even a conciliator would help in that case.
Yeah. Okay, I mean that's good to hear, because that is something that I've heard come up quite a bit. So I mean, it's good that the community is thinking about addressing these concerns. I guess
sorry, I just wanted to say, that's okay. Mediation's not magic, right? It's just mediation, right? And it is hard work, and so it's not always appropriate. Absolutely not, right? It's often useful. I guess I just want to send that message.
Okay. Another question has come in. I guess still from a skeptic. Are there pros and cons involved in mediation? What are some of the general concerns or I guess considerations to take when considering mediation?
Yeah, so I'm going to start answering this question by going back to the survey that we ran at CIDRA. And where people didn't use mediation, the main reason that they didn't, and if they said, well, we would have used mediation, but we went for a hybrid or we went for arbitration in cross-border disputes, it was because they had concerns about enforceability. Now, if you're in a domestic, because you've got an international dispute and you've got a contract, a mediated settlement agreement. So what we know is that, first of all, there's a high settlement rate. It varies dramatically depending on context and country, but more than 50% and sometimes up to 90% settlement rate for mediation. And most of the time, people stick to their agreements, but sometimes they don't. And where this happens, lawyers in particular, understandably, are worried about the lack of an expedited enforceability mechanism, right? If somebody breaches their mediated settlement agreement, I've got to go to court and prove the whole contract again. I may as well go to court in the first place. So it's generally speaking, it's a low risk, but it is a risk, right? And so that's one of the concerns that lawyers have. And one thing I haven't mentioned, which I need to, and most of the audience probably are aware of this, is that on the 12th of September this year, the Singapore Convention on Mediation will be ratified, will come into force rather. And that's a convention, the first UN treaty about mediation, and it's about the enforcement of cross-border mediated settlement agreements. And it's named after Singapore because of the major role that Singapore played in drafting this particular treaty. So in Singapore, we've got a number of pieces of legislation to enforce mediated settlement agreements, particularly if they're mediations that were conducted linked to a litigation process, but also if they're private commercial matters as well. So if it's a domestic setting, you don't need to worry about enforceability in Singapore, right? Everything is there for you, right? Absolutely, really robust, top class. If you're thinking about cross-border, many lawyers had a bit of a worry before. And I would say now, if you're still thinking about, even if it's cross-border, but enforcing in Singapore, right? We now have the Singapore, apart from the General Mediation Act, we now have the Singapore Convention on Mediation Act, which was brought into force in February, I think, this year. But with the coming into force of the convention, that convention will now offer an expedited enforcement mechanism for cross-border disputes amongst those countries that have ratified it, right? So it will take some time before you have a critical mass of countries to make that as attractive as arbitration, for example, in international settings. But certainly that's one of the concerns of lawyers primarily. Yeah. One of the things that we also found, this is not answering your question, but was that, but going back to technology, was that clients were more comfortable using technology than the lawyers, right? In our survey. So just sort of linking back to that, technology, if it's seen as an impediment for mediation by lawyers, it's certainly not by most clients, at least the ones that we surveyed.
Yeah, I mean, I can really see how everything's sort of coming together. I mean, we've got the sort of like the legal framework with the Mediation Convention. We've got technology that allows for all sorts of cross-border mediation to take place. And I mean, in a globalized world, you can definitely expect to see a lot more cross-border disputes arising just because people are just so much more connected. And of course, Singapore being Singapore, we are very open and globalized community. So it seems almost sort of like inevitable and natural that we've sort of been pushing towards this direction. So
I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, no, I've just looked at the time and realized we're just out of time. You mentioned globalized world, and I think, yeah, it's globalized, and there's quite a few, there's quite a lot of fragmentation going on around the world now as well, right? And even with these isolationist or sort of fragmented tendencies, mediation being the adaptable and agile process it is, allows individual players, right, to bypass that, right, and to really negotiate and create outcomes that work for both of them.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And you're right, with a lot of fragmentation is a good word that's happening around the world. The skill sets that mediation brings to the people who are mediators can definitely help to even, heal some of those cracks, if not in a commercial setting, in other settings as well. But I mean, we are out of time. So thank you very much, Nadja, for joining us and for sharing your thoughts. And thank you for all the attendees. Thank you for joining us and for your very interesting questions. Stay tuned till next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Hannah. Thanks, everyone.